Hello, hello. Welcome to the Institution and Norms section, session 3. It's great to go through this. Should I set some ground rules? We'll start at, well, in 1 minute specifically, but we'll put that off a bit. The session format is as follows. Speakers will present for 15 minutes each, followed by just a 20-minute Q&A of sorts, and we'll coordinate that in the background. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you for joining us. And Manasiwa is our first presentation, and should I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Nathan. So thanks to the CSAE Oxford 2021 conference and giving me the opportunity, and apologize, there's a slight change in my title of the presentation. This was work in the past few weeks, so I have renamed it Courts Redux, Micro Evidence from India. It's essentially about courts, how do courts function in developing countries, and how that affects economic development. A lot of early theoretical and empirical literature has sort of talked about the importance of courts for economic development, right? And the key functions of courts that we think of is, the role in timely enforcement of contracts and property rights. And so far, the view has been that, this leads to expectation effects, when there is an environment with better contract enforcement that lowers transaction costs and uncertainty in the market. And this is particularly useful and important for financial sector, which is highly contract intensive. And, having a stronger financial sector leads to firm growth. However, in addition, there is also liquidity effects, and that's something that I'm going to show you in today's presentation. In that, timely enforcement of disputes and litigation in courts frees tied up capital and factors of production that are involved in litigation. And this paper tends to fill an important gap in the literature that has not examined thus far disaggregated data from courts, in any country, let alone developing countries, and how the day-to-day functioning of courts, facilitates markets and local economy through, examining micro foundations behind that. So here's a cross-country correlation that suggests the importance of well-functioning courts. I mean, there's a clear negative relationship between how long it takes to resolve disputes in your ordinary trial courts and the GDP per capita, right? And this is important across countries, and it's not only specific in the context of development. So this paper examines how the ability of trial courts, which are sort of the first interface of the judicial system, in resolving disputes in a timely fashion, and how that affects local markets and firms and local economic development. So to study this, I exploit quasi-random variation in the judge vacancies in courts, and I use 2 different empirical strategies that I detail later during my presentation. To implement this, of course, there's a huge data challenge. So what I do is I construct a novel data set using trial-level microdata from district courts in India, which I'm then able to merge with credit market and firm level outcome variables. So just to quickly summarize, this paper highlights the role of local credit markets and better circulation of credits for improved trial resolution, faster disposal of pending cases, as an important mechanism behind the observed effects on firms in the local economy. And I do demonstrate change in firm behavior through their labor demand and value of production, sales revenue, and so on. So sort of the quick preview of what are the results that I want you to take away. First is, the capacity of the court itself. So when you add 1 additional judge to a court that has vacancies and has huge amount of pending cases, 1 additional judge helps resolve 200 pending trials in a given year. And so this then impacts total lending in the local credit market, particularly also to the industrial sector. So 1 judge, adding 1 judge to a court with vacancies increases sort of total loan disbursed in the credit market by about 0.7%. And this is huge. These credit markets are the size of a district. The local firms, which are sort of located in the territorial jurisdiction of these courts, then respond positively by expanding their sales revenue and increasing their wage expenditure. And I do find some suggestive evidence that this occurs due to better allocation of credit, like from highly leveraged firms that probably were not paying back their debt to firms that were less leveraged. So, not delving too much into the literature, there are three key contributions that this paper makes. First is it provides a well-identified causal evidence on the importance of local judicial capacity for local economic development using disaggregated data and institutional feature that generates quasi-random variation in the institutional ability, which is how many judges are available. The second is it contributes to the literature on state capacity and personnel, which has so far sort of missed looking at subnational judiciary. And finally, this paper highlights the importance of courts in facilitating credit markets through both expectation channel and liquidity channel, right? Because there is the faster recovery of loans through litigation that are processed faster, sort of enables this freed up capital to be lent further. So now I'm sort of jumping into the meat of the presentation, starting with the context. So the context that I study is India. And I mentioned earlier, it's the district court. So India has a unitary judiciary. There's one Supreme Court for the entire country. Each state has about, one or two states share high courts. There are about 24 high courts, and there are about as many district courts as a number of administrative districts in India, and many more like sub courts, the courts of the magistrate and civil court and so on below the district courts. The sanctioned judge strength is like shows that it's heavily, the judiciary is heavily constrained. We have less than 20 judges per million population in India. I mean, just to compare this with the United Nations recommendation that there need to be at least 70 judges per million. And when you compare this with OECD countries, and of course, we do see like US having 100 and like the median number of judges per population is 230 plus in the EU and so on. So not only are we constrained with like limited sanctioned strength of judges, in addition to this, there's high levels of vacancies among these positions across board in the judiciary. So among the district courts that I'm interested in, this the population of interest, about a quarter of the positions in these courts are vacant. And therefore, it's no surprise, although it's not causally established thus far, that there is also high backlog that we notice in these courts. About 11% of trials, 1 in 10, require more than 10 years to be resolved in these courts. So the data that I use for this paper is, the universe of all trials. Sorry, can I be heard? I suddenly don't see my mic feature.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So the data that I use is the universe of all trials from a sample of 195 district courts from all around India. And the period of study is 2010 to 2018. So using the trial level metadata, I construct the annual measures of backlog resolution at the level of the court. And the timestamps also allow me to measure judge occupancy, which is sort of the inverse of vacancy, like what fraction of the judge post in that particular district court is actually occupied and filled and is functional in a given year. And then I merge this data set with district level summary of credit, lending, and borrowing data from the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank. And then I can also merge it with the firm's balance sheet data using their registered office location. That's the key identifier on the firm's side. So just to give you a quick summary statistic, on average, it takes about, in a given year, only 14% of backlog or pending trials are resolved. So this is across different categories, and you see that bail petitions are somewhat faster processed, but if you just look at all kinds of civil or criminal litigation or accident claim processing, it's just like 14%. It's really, there's a ton of backlog cases. And the graph on the bottom shows you the variation, annual variation in what fraction of the judge posts are filled year to year. And you see that it's not really correlated with the underlying underlying district population. And it ranges between like 50% in some courts to close to 100%. So on average, the judge occupancy is 77%. This is close to the statistic that I mentioned, about a quarter of the positions are vacant. So because I observed this yearly variations in judge vacancies, this is, and then I looked into the institutional aspect behind it. And this is something that I exploit for my identification. So judges are recruited centrally. So they're not recruited by the court, but they're recruited by one step above the state. And these are mid-level legal professionals. So they need to have the legal degree, of course, but at least 7 years of experience in the practicing in the bar. And some states also have an exam. And judges retire at 60. So the career length is typically less than other professional occupations. It's definitely less than 30 years. And each tenure or each posting has a short tenure. So 2 to 3 years is what they typically serve. They never assign their home district or district where they've had past experience. This assignment is also managed centrally. There are various states have different allocation systems, based on seniority. But once they're assigned a particular court, then the administrative judge of the incoming court will assign the judge a courtroom, and she inherits the docket of cases, of all cases that were associated with the courtroom. And cases rarely move between courtrooms once they're actually ongoing. And so therefore, a court sees a constant flux of incoming and outgoing judges due to retirements, recruitments, and transfers that affects this yearly vacancy rate within a court over time. And this is sort of the quasi-random variation that I exploit to kind of then study the causal effects of delays in courts and on firm and local economic outcomes. So without showing you like balanced table here, I just want to kind of show you graphically that the underlying variation in the judge occupancy is uncorrelated with changes in the underlying district population growth rate. It's uncorrelated with the underlying literacy growth rate in the district. It's uncorrelated with the underlying urbanization rate, which is what fraction is urban population over time. And then it's also uncorrelated with other measures of the economy, which is per capita, rural consumption. That's what I've shown here, but I've also checked with per capita urban consumption and poverty rates. And I really don't find any significant or meaningful correlation. The scatter plots looks like a giant cloud. That's what we would like. And then why am I looking at the credit markets, right? So the structure of financial sector itself is highly contract intensive, and to enforce contracts, they repeatedly have to use the judiciary. And here I'm showing that in about 80% of the cases which involve a particular type of firm, like banks, if I look at cases involving banks, in over 80% of the cases, these banks are the primary complainants or the plaintiff or petitioner, as whatever you may call it, based on the context. And at the graph below, I show you the distribution of the number of cases filed by a specific type of firm in a given district court in a year. So you see that the financial sector has more number of cases per firm than firms in the non-financial sector. And so this kind of highlights the importance of courts for the credit markets. And that's something that I'm exploring. So the two key empirical strategies that I use is an event study model, where I have this yearly variation in judge occupancy, but that's a continuous variable. And so I look at an effect window of 3 years before and after, because the turnover, the judge tenure is usually 2 to 3 years before they retire or get transferred elsewhere. And then first I look at, what the left-hand side outcome that I'm interested in is the capacity of the court itself, like what is the rate of backlog resolution. And the second, outcome that I look at are all, credit market outcomes and the firm-related outcomes. I also have another empirical strategy, which I'm not going to be discussing or talking about, which is the instrumental variables approach, where I use judge vacancy as an instrument for the trial processing rate of the courts to back out an elasticity of how the local judicial capacity, functioning of the local judicial capacity affects the outcomes of interest.
That's really,
so
sorry,
yeah.
Excuse me, I'm jumping in because Nathan is having computer issues. This is
Okay,
your 2-minute warning.
Thank you. Yes.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Great. So here are the results in the next 2 minutes. So the first stage kind of is examining how vacancy affects the trial resolution rate. As I mentioned before, these estimates kind of, when you back out like an extra judge resolves 200 additional pending cases. It's robust to different way in which I sort of specify the empirical specification. So yeah, so here I've normalized the event study with respect to the T-1 year. And you can see that when there is a change, an increase in occupancy rates or the inverse of vacancy, we do see a bump up in the processing rate in courts. And you don't see any significant pre-trends in the past period. So it also kind of supports the fact that judge vacancies or the inverse of it is as good as random. Again, like for IV, there's a monotonic relationship. How many more judges get added is only increasing function in. The court's trial resolution is only an increasing function in the number of judges that get added. So, sort of that makes it a good candidate for IV. And then, sort of coming to the outcomes of interest. Again, looking at how much credit circulation that's happening overall in the local economy and how much credit circulation is being given to the industrial sector, we do see an overall increase resulting after an increase in judge in the local court. And then I show that this is happening because among the firms, because I have firm level data, among the highly leveraged firms, there's a decline in borrowing, so indicating some kind of repayment by the firms that were already engaged in debt litigation potentially, or whose leverage ratio, like debt to equity ratio, was really, really high. And on the other hand, I see an increase in borrowing among firms that were less leveraged. So there's some kind of like shifting of who gets the credit between firms. And so that shows that there is an overall improvement in firms' production factors by looking at their labor expenditure as well as sales revenue following an increase in the number of judges in a court. And so all I'm showing is that it kind of suggests that because
sorry, you're kind of closing, you're getting very close to being out of time. So if you can just wrap up.
Yeah. This is my last slide or whatever. Like I jump to the conclusion. Great, thank you. So this is just to show that the improvement in the outcomes that we see is mainly driven by firms that are less leveraged rather than the firms that were more leveraged and kind of like stuck with the bank capital with them. I'm not going to talk about the robustness, and I also do a back of the envelope cost effectiveness calculation. So I do show through this paper that reducing judge vacancies has a significant effect on trial resolution. So, adding more judges improves the functioning of the court. And this paper highlights a different aspect of courts in the sense that it's important for sort of greasing the local credit markets. And, I didn't show you the cost effectiveness, but it's in my paper. And, I showed that the return on investment of adding more judges or expanding the capacity of these courts is highly cost effective. So that's all I have. I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot. And sorry for barging in because Nathan is having computer issues. So now we kind of jumping to Junie, who's going to talk about an experiment she's been running in Nepal. And Junie, I'll give you a 5-minute warning. That's what you want?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present my job market paper that is titled Endogenous Institution, a Network Experiment in Nepal. This is a joint work with Giulio Iacobelli, who is also a PhD student at Paris School of Economics. So let me directly move on to the sort of the motivation behind this project. So often in developing countries where the formal institutions are very weak, it's the local communities that take the responsibility of running, say, community-based groups, forest user groups, poverty funds, and so on and so forth. So given such a scenario, it becomes important to understand what works well for such a setting in terms of increasing cooperation for communities and what does not. And so one of the mechanisms that is very widely used is peer monitoring, which is simply somebody from the village observing actions of other people in the village. So think about a community-based group where somebody is assigned the role of monitor within the village and sort of make sure that everybody does not cut the tree or in some sort of cooperative behavior. And the reason that this is effective is twofold. So firstly, of course, there could be some punishment embedded within the mechanism that if you do not do X, then you're going to get sort of punished from the community itself. But the second one, which is more interesting for us, is this reputation concern that has been emphasized by the seminal work by Ostrom, which are mechanisms based on social ties. So the fact that I cooperate more or I behave in a certain manner is very much driven by the fact that these people know me, and hence I'm incentivized to behave in a certain manner. In this paper in particular, we're going to be showing you a lab in the field experiment to understand demand for such a peer monitoring institution, focusing on the reputation concern factor. So where does social networks come in then? So when I say reputation, it's really important to know who is connected to whom, because I care most about what my friends think about me and so on and so forth. And in this setting, these are comparatively small villages, around 70 households. And so they rely very much on local connections, personalized relationship, be it for risk sharing, for public good provision, or information delivery. And so I really want to focus here that what we're going to be doing is looking at real social networks from Nepali villages and try to establish reputation concern as a plausible mechanism through which this peer effect, peer monitoring works. If you look at the literature, there are a couple of papers that sort of establish how important social network is and how people who are close together in a network are more likely to cooperate than people who are far away in the network. And of course, this whole literature on how trust is stronger between friends rather than people far away in the network, which is very intuitive. But what about people who do not know each other very well, they're not completely strangers, but they just don't have that sort of a friendly rapport. So in that case, there's this super interesting paper by Greza et al. That focus on this sort of a setting where allowing people to communicate in the presence of somebody who's central in the network, central in the sense somebody who's well known in the village, increases cooperation. And so what we do is basically take this one step forward and we ask, okay, so this is what happens when you are randomly assigned a monitor, but what if you are given the choice to choose your own monitoring institution? How does this vary across different group compositions? Who chooses a monitor versus who does not? Secondly, is there a difference in behavior with an elected monitor versus a randomly assigned one? So this idea of having chosen your own institution versus randomly assigning an institution. And thirdly, does this behavior at all vary across different group compositions? In particular, we're going to be looking at groups that are closely knit, in the sense everybody knows everybody, and sparse where groups do not know each other very well. Let me move on to what is it that we do, and then gradually move on to the lab in the field experiment. We're going to start off with a network survey covering 19 villages in rural Nepal, focusing on women who are 18 to 60 years old. We are going to be using this network survey primarily to look at who is connected to whom, so in order to form groups where each individual is going to be assigned to either a closed group or a group that is socially distant. And further, this is going to be used to choose monitor option candidates for each village. So each village is going to be assigned 2 plausible monitor candidates, somebody who's very central and somebody who's not central in the village. So this is all on the basis of the network survey. And following this, we're going to be doing a lab in the field experiment where it's going to be a simple public goods contribution game where people play in groups of 3. And the idea is that they see it's a non-anonymous game, so they see exactly who they're playing with, contribute in secret, and are allowed to elect a monitor to oversee this contribution game. And a monitor, if chosen, is going to simply observe the action of each individual and has no punishment power per se in the game. Let me just sort of briefly browse through the literature in the interest of time. So there are three main big puzzles sort of we try to fill, starting off mainly with endogenous institution and monitoring, and why sort of it's important to let people choose their own monitoring institutions. So we show that there is very much heterogeneous impact of choosing your own institution. It's different in groups that know each other very well, which we call dense, versus in groups that do not know each other very well. And of course, this upcoming literature on using real social networks in order to say something about the behavior of people. And we're going to be relying on social image concerns, other regarding preferences, in order to motivate the behavior in our experiment. So a little bit of context here, and then I move on to the experimental design. So we start off with a network survey, like I mentioned before, which is basically I ask every woman in the village, who do you spend time with, who do you borrow money from, and so on and so forth. So multi-dimensional relations. And so we come up with a network map, which looks something like this. This is one village where each circle represents a woman in the village, and a link established if either of them says that we are friends. And so on the basis of that, we identify potential monitors, somebody who's central and somebody who's less central. So the red one is more central here, and the blue one would be somebody who's low central in the network. Addition to that, we're also going to be assigning each individual in the network. So this individual green, for instance, is going to be assigned to these two individuals red randomly, which are dense groups, and these individuals blue, which could be considered as sparse groups. Again, randomly we assign these groups. Let me give you an experimental design overview, and then try to just briefly touch up on each of these aspects. So what are the steps? What do we start from? We have the network survey. We start then by randomizing groups. Each individual is going to be playing both in a dense group and in a sparse group, where we randomize the order of which group you're playing with. And this is essential in order to sort of get the individual fixed effects that would otherwise be problematic, given that it's an endogenous network setting. Following this, people see exactly who they're playing with, and then there is going to be a voting stage where you can choose either between having no monitor, having a high central monitor, or somebody who's low central in the network. So these people, remember, are external to this group of three people, and they are the same monitor options that are fixed for each village. So we have 19 villages and 19 high central monitors, 19 low central monitor options. Once people vote in secrecy, so it's a voting at the level of the individual, we randomize the order whether you play with a monitor of your choice versus a randomly assigned monitor, what we call exogenous. And once we randomize the order using simple color of balls, you play first a contribution game, depending on the randomization, either with a monitor of your choice or a monitor of our choice. And I would like here to focus on the fact that the identity of the monitor chosen by the group is only revealed right before the endogenous round. So right before people play with the monitor that is chosen by the group. So this is going to be an important piece of information that I'm going to come back to later. And so each women, to summarize, are going to be playing 4 rounds, 2 in dense, 2 in sparse, which is endogenous and exogenous. Okay, I'm assuming here that the experimental design is clear. In the interest of time, I'm going to just browse through the contribution game. So it's a simple public goods game where everything you contribute to the public pot, as you see here in this figure, increases in value by 50% and is divided equally irrespective of initial contribution. Here I would like to focus on the fact that everybody has tokens of different colors, and the fact that we do that is so that it's easy for the monitor, if elected, to come inside the room and observe the contribution of each individual in the contribution game. So the role of the monitor would then be to come inside the room and see exactly how much each individual contributed, which would otherwise be private information.
Junie,
okay.
This is your 5-minute warning.
5 minutes, so okay, perfect. Let me then, so again, highlight the fact that the monitor privately observes contribution of each individual with no power to impose fine per se during the game. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip on the mechanism, but we're really trying to rely on this reputation concern based idea where dense groups already know each other, so they feel not the need to be monitored, whereas sparse groups, they do not know each other very well and hence prefer to have this external monitor, preferably somebody who's central to the network, has more power to communicate their performance in the game in order to improve level of cooperations. So we see here from the graph here that sparse groups are more likely, marked in blue, to choose a high central monitor than dense group, very much in line with our hypothesis. We also established this with multi-logit fixed effect regression. So sparse groups are more likely to choose to be monitored given the choice to elect a monitoring institution, whereas dense groups prefer not to be monitored. With respect to exogenous contribution, this is very much in line with what Breza et al. Find in their paper, where contribution increases in the presence of a randomly chosen monitor, but only in sparse groups. So the more interesting question to ask is, what would happen then when people are allowed to choose their own monitoring institutions? And in order to do that, I'm going to show you this piece of information in two pieces. So first, we're going to be looking at no monitor being chosen by the group for both sparse and dense group, followed by a high central monitor being chosen by the group in both sparse and dense groups. The reason I'm doing this is because people select into a particular monitoring institution. Hence, in order to control for that, I am going to look at only cases where people interact with the same sort of institution in the same group, but just how they interact is different. So the blue one shows what they do in exogenous, and the red one shows what they do in endogenous monitoring period. So here you see that for sparse groups, there is a significant increase of having chosen your own monitoring institution versus in dense groups. Dense groups, there is slight difference, but not very stark. Again, if you look at election of a high central monitor, if groups are given a choice to elect their own monitoring institution, contribution goes up even when a high central monitor is elected for sparse groups, whereas in dense groups, there is not much of an effect. And in order to sort of give you more evidence on why is this happening, or our reasoning of why people are contributing more in endogenous, so one story would be to say because they feel more empowered, but the story that we're sort of trying to push here is to say it's not the story of empowerment, it's simply because that the choice of the group is revealed right before the endogenous round, which sort of helps you update your beliefs about the existing level of cooperation or of the group. So you see here, I'm going to summarize both the endogenous and exogenous round played in the same group, where blue stands for the cases where exogenous is played first, red is when endogenous round is played first. So if you play endogenous first, there is going to be some spillover over even to the exogenous round. So you expect more of the action to happen in the red bar. So you see here that it's higher for sparse groups. Again, now you also see here that something is happening for the dense groups. What is more interesting is if you look at high central monitors. So if the group is given a chance to choose their own monitor, I have 1 minute and I'm quickly going to wrap up, Julien. If they're given their own choice to choose a monitor, having chosen a high central monitor sends a negative signal to the group, especially in dense group, and the contribution actually decreases in endogenous groups. In dense groups specifically, having played endogenous first, because this extra piece of information pulls down your belief about how cooperative the group was. I'm going to skip over this result. It's basically just showing what I just explained with the graph. And to conclude, when given the choice to elect a monitor, sparse groups prefer to be monitored compared to closely knit dense groups, allowing communities to choose their own monitoring institution instead of assigning random ones improves cooperation, but only limited to sparse groups. This has very much implications for community-based development projects in developing countries. And we also need to keep in mind that disclosing the choice of the group can send additional signal about what the existing level of cooperation is in the group. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your comments in the question and answer section, and this is my email ID. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Julie. That was really exciting and well presented, very clearly presented. So thanks for that. And now we're going to move to Antoine Boucher, who's going to talk about some project on using procurement data in the World Bank, if I remember correctly. So Antoine, over to you. You have 15 minutes, and I just want to remind you that we will ask all the questions at the end, but you should feel free to kind of put your questions down in the Q&A box now, and then it kind of makes it easier to plan for the Q&A section later. So don't feel shy and kind of ask your questions in the Q&A as soon as you want. No need to wait. Right. So Antoine, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So hello everyone, and I'm glad to present our work that is still in progress and that is co-authored with Lisa Chauvet and Marin Ferry about the political cycle in World Bank procurement contract. So our research question is the following. So do firms win more World Bank procurement around election years in their origin country? So before entering in the core of our mechanisms, it seems important to first present the process of allocation for World Bank contract. So at the very beginning, the World Bank agrees to fund a project in a given country. And it is then the duty of the recipient government to choose the firm in charge of the project execution. So in order to make this choice, there are four main methods of allocation. So first, there's the quality and cost-based selection, which is the most used allocation in our sample, and that is used only for consultancy contracts. Then we have the international competitive bid. So in this case, the recipient government is going to advertise internationally the call for tender, and firms from every nationality can bid. In third, we have the single source selection. So in this case, the recipient government can choose the winning firm at its discretion. And this method is of course not the most favored by the World Bank, but it is still used for some civil war contracts. And finally, we have the national competitive bid, which is very similar to the international one. The only difference being that only firms coming from the recipient country can is allowed to bid. So a supplier firm is chosen through one of those methods. So then the World Bank transfers their funds and the project can begin. So our hypothesis is that firms win more World Bank contracts around election years in their origin country. So in other words, we suggest that World Bank contracts are the object of a kickback arrangement, meaning that it will be World Bank contract in exchange of campaign funding. So it is important here to distinguish whether the supplier firms comes from the recipient country or not, because it implies two different mechanisms. So let's first see the case where the supplier firm does not come from the recipient country, but from a country that we are going to call S. So let's assume that the incumbent government from S is going to face an election soon and is looking for funds for their electoral campaign. So one of the ways to get funds would be to help a firm coming from the same country to win a World Bank contract in country R, that is a recipient country. So S government would therefore use their economic or diplomatic power over R to make sure that government from R is going to choose a firm coming from S. So remember that government from R is in charge of choosing the supplier firm for the World Bank project. So if the influence is fruitful, R chooses a firm coming from S in order to execute the World Bank contract. So then the winning firm is grateful and accepts to fund the electoral campaign of the incumbent government S in exchange. So let's take a concrete example from our dataset in order to illustrate this mechanism. So there's the French firm Colas that won a World Bank contract for the construction of 3 bridges in Madagascar in 2011. So it was 1 year before the presidential election in France. So in our mechanism, the French incumbent at the time would have pressured the Malagasy government to choose Colas, and the latter would have found the electoral campaign in exchange. So of course, we do not say this happened particularly for this contract, but it was in order to illustrate the mechanism. And we can now see the case where the supplier firm comes from the recipient country. So the mechanism is very similar, the only difference being that there is no cross-country influence. So incumbent government from country R will soon face an election and also wants to be re-elected and is looking for funds. And this government is also in charge of choosing a supplier firm for World Bank contracts. So the recipient government can decide to allocate more contracts to domestic firms, potentially in exchange of a campaign funding. So no matter if the supplier firms come from R or S, both mechanisms implies an electoral interest to favor a domestic firm for the attribution of a World Bank contract, and this interest resides in the kickback arrangement. So we can, however, think about several limits to the mechanism we presented. So first, the World Bank can review the supplier choice and can put its veto if they see any irregularities. However, based on the paper of Zheng and Gutmann, the World Bank reviews only 30% of the World Bank of the contract attributed through international competitive bid. So this relatively weak supervision associated with the existence of single source selection makes our story still possible. Also, our mechanisms generally imply a relative failure of the World Bank contract attribution. And regarding the existing literature, this assumption is also likely. So for instance, we have the paper from Zheng and Gutmann and Elena McLean that found both the existence of a domestic preference for the supplier choice, and also another work that showed that recipients receive more contracts when they have a representative in the board of directors of the World Bank. So another limit, an additional limit in our story would come from the assumption that government act in the general interest and not especially for an electoral interest, and that they are willing to maximize the efficiency of multilateral aid. So they would, in this case, they would let the best firm win the contract and not interfere in the process. However, some paper from Bracco, Bertoli, and Gramby can let us think the opposite. So they found that mayors in Italy are willing to put the electoral interest above the general interest by applying a laxer road law before local election. Also now focusing a bit more on our cross-country mechanism, we could think that our cross-country story of influence is a bit exaggerated. But previous literature shows us the opposite. So for instance, we have a paper from Kuzenko and Worker and Dreher and co-authors that found that countries would receive significantly more aid from the United States, the IMF, and the World Bank during years where they had a representative at the Security Council of the United Nations. So in this case, the United States would use their economic influence in order to buy a vote from a developing country at the UN. And finally, we are making the hypothesis of a solid connection between firm and government, especially for the case of campaign funding against contract. And such a relation has already been demonstrated in Czech Republic and Russia for public procurement. So the potential existence of such a political cycle is a subject that matters. So first, the procurement is the World Bank preferred way of doing aid, as it would be more efficient than grants or concessional loans. But here, this efficiency is challenged. So the firm chosen for electoral motives may not be the best in order to execute the project. And the paper from Lene underlines this idea and try to compute the cost of such electoral allocation. And they found that public road contracts in India that were very likely to be attributed for political connection reasons are the ones that are the most likely to never be constructed. And in addition to this efficiency issue, the fact that incumbent government can use the World Bank attribution in order to get more electoral funds is an unfair advantage regarding other candidates. And those two issues could even intensify in the future, as the World Bank is willing to give more independence to the recipient government for the supplier choice. So the paper that we present today could contribute to both the literature of the political cycle in procurement and to the literature of the World Bank contract. So first, by its econometric method, so we are using a gravity model, which is a novelty for both literatures. And the result we find could be a nice complement to the paper of Zheng and Gutmann and Elena McLean. So they both find a domestic preference for the attribution of World Bank contract. And we could add that this domestic preference is more pronounced around election years. So let's now move forward to our empirical strategy. So in order to estimate the impact of election in country S over the number of contracts won by firms coming from the same country, we are using a gravity model with 3 dimensions: supplier, recipient, and year. So our dependent variable is the number of World Bank contracts that happened in country R, won by firms coming from S during the year T. So cases where R is equal to S are included. So for instance, if Nigerian firms won 10 contracts for projects that happened in Nigeria, so it will be taken into account. Also, a relation where there was no contract are also included. So for instance, if no firms from Pakistan won a contract in Bolivia in 2010, this line will exist as well and will exhibit 0. So our variable of interest is a set of 4 dummy variables taking the value 1 if the year T is respectively 2 years before, 1 year before, the same year, or 1 year after an election year in the country S, which is the origin country of the supplier firm. We also include a time variant supplier, time variant recipient, and bilateral controls. And we include year, time invariant supplier, time invariant recipient, and dyadic fixed effect. So let's now see our baseline results. So firms coming from S seems to win more World Bank contracts 1 year before and during the election years in their origin country. So we then distinguish between the case where the supplier firms comes from the recipient country or not. And the political cycle seems to be domestic rather than cross-country. So meaning that it would occur only within the recipient country. We wanted then to exploit the heterogeneity in terms of contract allocation and sector. So first, the focus on contract allocation method. So we are here replacing the dependent variable by the number of World Bank contract attributed through one specific method that happened in country R, won by firm coming from S in year T. And the political cycle seems to be stronger in cases where the contract was attributed through single source selection and national competitive bid, which is logical regarding the mechanism explained in the introduction. So it is in fact easier to choose your favored firm for electoral purpose through one of those methods. And we do the same kind of dependent variable modification for the contract sector. So the political cycle seems to be stronger for consultancy and civil war contracts. So it seems once again logical with our story, at least for civil war contracts. And we want then to explore more the chronism dimension of our mechanism. Unfortunately, we do not have firm characteristic data. So we are therefore not able to see if the political cycle is stronger for politically connected firms. We can, however, see if the political cycle is stronger if conditions for kickback arrangement are reunited. So first, we are doing subsample by political system. And we can see that firms seems to win more World Bank contract around election years if their origin country has a parliamentary or presidential system. And in the same vein, political cycle seems to exist only if the origin country has a non-autocratic regime. So it seems once again logical, as the kickback mechanism is likely to happen only if there is a campaign to found and if there's a real possibility for the incumbent to lose power. And finally, we proceed to subsample regarding political finance. So here we focus on countries where firms can legally fund candidate and political party in opposition with country where it is not authorized. And we see that firms win more World Bank contracts around election years in their origin country if they can legally fund candidate or political parties. So in opposition, the political cycle does not seem to exist in countries where it is not authorized. So let's now go to the conclusion. So as a conclusion, our results suggest the existence of a political cycle in World Bank procurement contract, as firms would win on average 14% more contracts around election years in their origin country. So this political cycle seems to be domestic rather than cross-country. And we also find some hints of a kickback arrangement being World Bank contracts against campaign funding. So as I said in the introduction, this work is still ongoing and we still want to add some modifications such as the following. So we could withdraw autocratic countries from our analysis as the mechanism cannot occur in those countries and they may only add noise in our results. We could also add a thinner time dimension. So we indeed have the precise date of the contract and we could use the NELDA database in order to have the precise date of the election. So our time dimension could therefore be months or trimester rather than years, which would prevent us from issues when an election occurs in January or December, for instance. Also, there's the paper from Kersing and Colby that suggests that recipient country would receive more World Bank funds before election years. So here, the domestic political cycle that we find could mechanically come from the fact that recipient countries simply receive more contracts before their election. So in order to account for that, we could replace our actual dependent variable by the share of contract that happened in R won by firm coming from S in year T. And finally, we wanted to explore more the cross-country dimension, which was our original theory in the mechanism presented in the introduction. And we have a promising result with the mean amount on the left-hand side. So that's it for me, and I'll be glad to have your comments and questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Antoine. That was really interesting and kind of brought me back to the days where I was a World Bank loan ranger, and some of those stories are consistent with some past experiences, sadly. Anyway, now we have 50 minutes to listen to Eva.
Yes.
Talk to us about our research. Thanks a lot.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So thank you all for attending this presentation, and thank you very much to the organizing team as well. So I am Eva Ten, fourth year PhD student from the Toulouse School of Economics. And the paper I am presenting today explores the origins of a gender bias cultural norm, namely matrilineality, and its consequences on women's socioeconomic status in sub-Saharan Africa. So because of time constraint, I will only focus on the second part of my paper about the contemporary impact of this cultural norm on women's socioeconomic status. So the most universal and intractable issues women face globally come from discriminatory social institutions within the family. The Social Institutions and Gender Index, created by the OECD, examines the level of discrimination against women within the family in terms of household responsibilities, so how many times women spend doing household work, domestic work, divorce, inheritance rights, etc. And so the map here represents this index with the darker colors corresponding to a stronger discrimination. And what we can notice first is that developing countries are performing the worst. However, we can observe variation even within developing countries. And there is a significant variation within the African continent as well. So what can explain those variations? Is it underdevelopment itself, or is it due to certain cultural views held by poor societies that would lead to gender inequality? So in this paper, I am specifically interested in a specific type of social institution or cultural norm. I'm interested in kinship systems. So kinship system define inheritance, the inheritance of name, goods, and privileges of individuals, and they define the obligation and the distribution of resources among family members. So there exist different types of kinship systems, but most of them are gender specific. So basically, you inherited and still inherit in some societies from either your mother or your father. So in matrilineal kinship system, inheritance is through mothers, while in patrilineal kinship systems, inheritance is through fathers. So you are more likely, men are more likely to inherit in those societies, while women are more likely to inherit in matrilineal societies. And so, although not all matrilineal societies are similar, they share a sizable number of characteristics. So women will be more empowered in those societies, they will be more valued, and they will be, because also they will be more likely to inherit property, potentially increasing their bargaining power. So the questions I seek to answer in this paper are the following. First, which geoclimatic origins led to the emergence of matrilineal kinship system in sub-Saharan Africa? And second, what are the long-term effects of matrilineal kinship systems on the socioeconomic status of women? And for this presentation, I will only focus on this second question. So here I am not interested, I'm not focused on gender equality per se, but rather on forces and constraints generated by kinship systems. And sub-Saharan Africa is an ideal setting to study this because there is a strong persistence of ancestral norms on the continent and also a strong ethnic cleavage. We also have rich ethnographic and anthropological data, and of course a significant variation in kinship system within the continent. So as we can see here, so the map represents here the territories historically occupied by ethnic groups, with in blue the patrilineal ethnic groups, and in red the matrilineal ethnic groups. So this paper speaks to the literature on the impact of cultural and economic outcomes, but more precisely on the impact of kinship system on economic outcomes. And here I provide novel evidence on how kinship system affects women's socioeconomic status using a sample of 500,000 women from 25 countries from sub-Saharan Africa with the causal methods. And I also shed light on the trade-off between, well, in parental investment choices between human capital and physical capital. So what are the data that I'm using to answer to this question? So I first use the demographic and health survey. So this data, this database provides information on current socioeconomic status and other characteristics of 500,000 women for 25 countries from 1988 to almost nowadays. And so here are the data from this, here are the observations that I have from this data. Then I am also using the ethnographic atlas in order to have the ethnic group, the kinship group of origin of each woman. So I merged both database with the ethnic group of origin because luckily the DHS provide this information. And so here are the observations that I have after the merge with the blue dots corresponding to women respondents from patrilineal societies and the red dot corresponding to women respondents from matrilineal ethnic groups. So to answer to this question, I used three different identification strategies. So first, I perform a knowledge regression with fixed effects at the individual level I. So I regress here women's socioeconomic outcomes on matrilineality, which is equal to 1 if the respondent is of matrilineal origin and 0 if it's of patrilineal origin. I use a battery of control variable, historical, geoclimatic, and individual controls. And I also use a year of survey, country, and ethno-linguistic group fixed effects. And because I am worried about endogeneity between my socioeconomic outcomes and matrilineality, the likelihood of being of matrilineal origin, I perform a geographic regression discontinuity design here where I compare women located in villages that are really close together, and when the main only difference for the village is of being of either matrilineal origin or patrilineal origin. And I basically use this distance from the village to the ethnic border as an exogenous variation. And then finally, if I have time to show this, in a nutshell, I also do an IV strategy where I instrument ancestral matrilineality with a geoclimatic index that I created from anthropological theories explaining the emergence of those systems of matrilineal societies from climate characteristics, climatic characteristics. So I find here that, well, findings suggest that matrilineal origin women are more empowered within the traditional sphere. So, and here OLS and RDD results confirm and they go into the same direction. So I found that matrilineal origin women are less likely to have a domestic or household status. And I found in terms of magnitude decrease of baseline probability of 40%. Those women are also more likely to contribute the most to household expenses compared to their partner. And also those women are more likely to own a land or a house alone. So I found here 4.6 to 4.2 percentage point increase of owning a land or a house alone, and this corresponds to an increase of 30% of baseline probability. However, those women have a lower status within the modern sphere. So I found that they are less educated compared to their patrilineal counterpart. I found one less year of education, also a negative impact on literacy based on reading passage during the survey. And those women also, as a matter of fact, are less likely to work in the tertiary sector. So basically to work in a management or service job as opposed to a manual or agricultural job. And so, yes.
This is your 5-minute warning. Yeah.
Okay. So this is just to show you the graph of the RDD coefficient statistics, so that we really see this cutoff at the border, and it's really important to bring causal evidence of matrilineality. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And then I perform an IV strategy. So here I go in a nutshell. I won't go into detail, but I construct a geoclimatic index from 2 anthropological theories explaining the emergence of matrilineal societies. So according to which matrilineal societies would prevail in area with extensive whole agriculture, because this type of agriculture allows women to participate more into the agricultural task, and so to increase the agricultural production and their landed property, but in areas without animal husbandry. So I build an index from FAO data, from FAO geoclimatic suitability measure data, combining those 2 dimensions, and I instrument ancestral matrilineality with this geoclimatic index. And as a first stage, I found a strong correlation between ancestral matrilineality and the index. And again, quickly, the IV coefficients confirm the RDD and the OLS results. Then I also look at matrilineal women relative to matrilineal men outcomes. And what I want to show just here is that matrilineal women are more likely to own a land or house alone compared to matrilineal men. So it really shows that those women in those societies hold immovable assets. I'm also exploring some mechanisms, potential mechanisms. I'm still working on this part. So basically, my interpretation and also the results that I have show that those women are more likely to own a land or house alone. They're also more likely to have a rural status, meaning that they inherit land, they work on the land they inherited, and so they are in a way destined to stay close to this land and close to their family. So this might also undermine social mobility. Also, they might not need education. They might not need to be educated because they already have assets. And also, those women are more likely to be divorced. This means that those women can afford divorce because they have kin and financial support. And this can be also understood as a dimension of empowerment. So I am concluding now. So just to close the loop, I just show here that matrilineality has a negative impact on the social institution and gender index, the CG index that I presented in the introduction, measuring the level of discrimination of women within the family. And so this matrilineality explains an important variation of this index, even when controlling for country income level. So to conclude, matrilineal origin women are more independent within the traditional sphere. However, some efforts remain to be done within the modern sphere because those women are less educated. And one potential mechanism would be a difference in parental investment choices towards physical capital within matrilineal societies, as opposed to human capital within patrilineal societies. And so those findings highlight the persistence of cultural norms, so their heterogeneity, but also the persistence of cultural norms and how those cultural norms are, how important they are, in implementing and determining the effectiveness of public policies. Because yes, in some areas of the world, informal laws can be stronger than public policies of formal laws. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Eva, and all of you for a great presentation. We have a fair bit of time for Q&A, so that's great. There's a question in the Q&A that I'm going to start by asking, and then you, as I said before, if you have kind of more questions, write them in the Q&A and I'll call on you. So Antoine, Victor Pouliken is asking whether you could extend your analysis to bilateral aid agencies, such as kind of USAID or the French development agencies, and kind of how do you think the bilateral organization would compare to the World Bank on that dimension?
Yes, so I saw that my co-author Marin responded in the chat, but I'm going to answer as well. To extend the analysis to bilateral aid agencies, that would be very interesting. I don't know if those kind of data is available, but that if it exists, that would be awesome to extend the analysis. And on if would there be also a political cycle at like the World Bank? Maybe bilateral agencies are less prone to domestic political cycle, as they may not do procurement but grants or loan, or if they do procurement, they could impose the contractors and not let the choice to the recipient. And but maybe with bilateral agencies, the cross-country dimension would be maybe stronger, as the election in the country of origin of the agency. It would be very easy in this case to allow a procurement contract and impose your contractors before election years in your country. Yes, but that would be something very interesting to do.
Thanks, that's great. Now we have a question from Yasmin for Eva, I think.
Yes. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So I was wondering, what would be the role of the identity of the colonizer in explaining this effect, since we know that geoclimatic conditions are also linked to the identity of the colonizer and the quality of institution, for instance?
So I control for the roots of colonizers, if this is your question, but I haven't explored further. So I think it's something I should look at. Thank you.
Could be interesting to know the interaction
yes,
between those.
I guess there's a bit of recency bias. We have a bunch of questions for Eva. So I'm going to call on Harry first. Harrison, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yes, I have a question for you. Yes, hi. Thank you for the great presentation. I was wondering if you have looked at children's nutritional intake, because that is another dimension of human capital investment, but it is difficult to say that that's on modern sphere or the traditional spheres. I think it would be interesting to take a look at those.
So I think there is, I haven't looked at that, but I think there is this this outcome variable in the DHS, I think. Children nutrition, right?
Right, yes, that there is one. So that's why I was asking. I think you can take a look at them.
Thank you.
Great. So I was sent a question for Manaswini. So there's two questions actually. One, the first one is, are there any factors that predict the filing of a judge vacancy in any court year, and whether that could be endogenous, and whether you're a bit worried about that? And also asking whether you might be able to get data on other court vacancies, not just judge vacancies, but kind of more broadly court vacancies that could also affect the speed with which the justice is done in those courts.
Right. Thanks, Julian. So your first question was like, how do judges get appointed to a court with vacancies, right? So one is, so as I mentioned, it's done centrally by the High Court, and there is some preference given to seniority. It's like a serial dictatorship mechanism. Each judge, you know, when they're coming to an end of their tenure, they'll say, I want, you know, these are my, you know, 3 preferences that I want to go next. And then they collect it across all judges and try to assign based on that, and then breaking ties based on seniority. The question is, you know, whether all judges then move towards districts that are more favorable, you know, and therefore, like, you know, you'll have lower vacancies in such courts, which I don't find is the case, because, you know, they have like many more constraints in addition to this rank choice, is that, you know, they can't rank the home district to be like among the preferred district, or they cannot serve in the district where they've already served in the past. So, you know, past locations already get eliminated. And I don't really find an empirical support for any kind of gaming or, you know, endogeneity in the role of vacancy variation that's correlated with the underlying local economic dynamic factors of the district. So it's sort of as good as random. They just have a limited number of choices to make, and then they just rotate through that. And there are also retirements that are happening at the same time. So that's adding to vacancies over time. And the second question you asked about vacancies among general court staff, I don't have data on that, unfortunately, because the data allows me only to observe the presiding judge. And so the other staffs, I mean, if I were to just think of the production function of the judiciary, it's the judge that's sort of the key in giving hearing dates and writing the judgment and recording hearings. And so sort of like the judge himself or herself is like the key input to the production function, and the other staff are more sort of in the admin and management of the functioning of court. Of course they could have an effect, but I don't have the data to observe that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There's another question for Junie that I'm gonna read out. So person is asking whether you can elaborate on the policy implications of your results in the design of programs managed by communities. Could your results explain why the literature on community-based management is a bit mixed in a sense?
Mm-hmm. So thank you for the question, Victor. So I think the punch of the paper really is to say that allowing communities to choose their own institutions improves cooperation, but this impact is very heterogeneous across different social networks, basically in groups where maybe they're very homogeneous in terms of caste or very closely knit together, versus in groups that are more spread out and they do not know each other very well. But we see like largely the effect of positive for the sparse groups, whereas for the dense groups there is not much of a change. So it makes sense for them to allow people to choose their own monitoring institutions. Of course, I'm talking about small scale projects like forest user groups, small funds, and so on and so forth, not like large infrastructure projects. And with respect to, does this explain the literature on community-based management being mixed? I think it does sort of give us a hint on why this is the case, because it's important to understand the underlying structure of the community in order to sort of see how the level of cooperation varies. But I think it's also important to sort of answer what is the best way to go about electing this peer monitor then. So we know that the third person doesn't work from outside the community, but electing somebody from within the community, what is the best way to go about it? I think this could be super interesting sort of follow-up to look at.
Thank you. Mattia has a question for Eva. Mattia, do you want to ask your question?
I can, if you can hear me. Hi, everyone.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit on your RDD identification strategy, because if I understand correctly, you're using the distance from the boundary between two ethnicities. And I was wondering if you did some tests to check whether the location of the boundary itself is indicative of some difference in environment between the two areas that might affect your outcomes. But maybe I've missed something, so please elucidate on that. Thanks.
So no, you're right to ask the question, because I presented it very in a nutshell. So first, this ethnic border doesn't correspond to any actual border, so no country borders. That's why it allows me to really capture the effect of culture. So what I didn't mention here is that in this paper, I also look at the geoclimatic origin of those systems. So I built a geoclimatic index that explained 10% of the variation in kinship system in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, well, I found that geoclimate has an impact on those systems. Then for the RDD, so for contemporary data, contemporary analysis, I control for geoclimatic characteristics at the border. And I still have an impact. So meaning that there is also, culture has an impact. Those cultural norms have an impact. And there is not a strong difference, even not only significant difference in geoclimatic characteristic at both sides of the border. So.
Thank you.
But thank you for your question.
Thanks. There's a question. Sorry, I'm going a little. Actually, let's go to question by. It's another question for Eva from John. John Struthers, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Eva,
Hi.
I was just wondering what you meant by the difference between the modern sphere and the traditional sphere. I think you didn't really explain that.
Yeah, no.
You ran out of
So,
time. If you don't mind, thank you.
So the traditional sphere would be all the outcomes related to family, household status. So within the family, and modern would be outcomes related, well, labor market outcomes and education. So it's the name I have chosen to put for those two types of outcomes. Yes, I hope this is clear.
Thank you. Yes, it's clear. Thank you.
We have another question from Antoine from Hasegawa. Do you want to ask your question, Hasegawa?
Perhaps just ask the question.
I can just read it. Yeah. Let me just find it again. So Hasegawa is interested in kind of the fact that the World Bank procurements can be classified in technical areas such as contracting or manufacturing, and non-technical areas such as kind of delivering, let's say, food or staff. And do you have any evidence that like the cycles that you observe are present in both of those contexts, or maybe some differences to explore as well?
We indeed did some focus on the sector of the contract. So we have not technical or non-technical, but we do by good, which are non-technical, and consultancy and civil works. And we saw that the political cycle is a bit stronger in case of civil work and consultancy. At least for the civil work, it's something that we expected, that will have a particular effect and particularly prone to a kickback arrangement. As civil work contract, it is usually higher amount in dollars, so more interesting to do a kickback arrangement with a contract with a high amount. And also there's already a connection between civil work firms and government with the public contract. So yes, I hope I answered to the question.
Yes, thanks. All right, any more questions? The other thing I should ask, if panelists have questions for other panelists, this is free for all. You can all, throw questions at each other. Of course, you can just, you cannot work on the Q&A, but you can raise your hand and then I can call on you, obviously. Antoine, I guess, yeah.
Yes, I don't have a question, but I see something in the Q&A from Ondino Okello. May I answer it?
Sure, I missed that one. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, no problem. So yes, the question was, I don't know if anyone sees, so I'm going to read it out. So from your study, do we conclude that world powerful economies, especially the ones controlling actual influence election in developing countries? And if yes, to what extent? So here in this case, the way powerful economies could have an influence on election on developing countries would be by giving more procurement contract before election in country R, knowing that the incumbent government from country R will use it in order to have more fund or more support. So on this question, there's the paper from Kirsting and Kilby that is very interesting, and that found that more World Bank funds are allowed before election in a recipient country if the government from the recipient country is aligned with the United Nations regarding the vote at the United Nations. So here now the question would be, does giving more contracts to a recipient country really help the incumbent government to gain more votes? I think that would be an interesting question, yes.
Right. So actually, Ondino also had a question for Eva, which is, do we say from your study that in matrilineal society, girls' education is not valued? You're muted, I think.
So this would be, thank you for your question first. This would be my interpretation indeed, but I am still exploring this in the explanatory mechanism part. So I still need to dig deeper into this, but yeah.
looks like we're out of questions for the Q&A. Any additional questions? Just out of curiosity, Junie, how did you collect the you went very fast. How did you collect the network data in terms of making sure you get the maps right? And also, I noticed that you said you code a link as soon as one of the two person reported the other person being friend. How much of is there a lot of missing links that only one person reports being a friend to the other, and how do you try to manage that in the analysis?
So first, how do we conduct the network survey? We basically have a list of all the women in the village. So we basically go door to each woman with a team of enumerators, and we ask them questions along various dimensions. So we tell them, give us names of at least 3 friends that you spend time with, that you borrow from, and on the basis of these questions, sort of form the network map. And on an average, people name around 4, so not more than 4. But if you look at the number of connections, on an average, people end up having 8 to 9 connections. So that means there are a lot of links that are not reciprocal, in the sense, I say that Julia is my friend, but Julia does not take my name. So the way we deal with this is we're really interested in sort of non-directional network for the purpose of our experiment, but it will be also interesting to see sort of intensity of link, if I name the same person for multiple questions, and also if what proportion of the links are reciprocal. We haven't done that so far. We can take a look at it.
Thanks. Mattia has a question for Manaswini.
Hi again. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm terrible at remembering 3 presentations ago, so I'm going to have to ask a clarifying question first. Can you remind me the definition of your explanatory variable again? What's your judge occupancy variable? And then after you answer that, I may have another question.
Sure, sounds good. It's just that the number of sanctioned judge positions, or the courtrooms that have a judge present in a given year.
Okay, so and forgive me if I missed that, but do you worry that this measure is a reduced form for the efficiency of the administration in appointing the judges rather than the actual presence of the judge? Is that something you discuss in the paper, or am I completely out of touch?
No. So I view this as a reduced form approach to measuring the capacity of the courts in its ability to resolve disputes and trials. So basically, I'm able to see how many of the courtrooms are actually occupied by a judge, and therefore, the flow of resolutions and the cases are actually happening, being heard year after year. If a courtroom is vacant, then there's nothing happening to the docket of the cases. So I basically the availability of judges is like a reduced form way of seeing how quickly the court moves forward in resolving the disputes. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Sorry, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. My own thoughts, which is always terrible. No, but I mean, what I mean is that I obviously do not doubt the fact that if you have a judge present, he can deliver much better. I was wondering if you have any results about the overall efficiency of the administration of the court, if that's something you observe somewhere in your data, rather than on the presence of the judges. And again, forgive me if you have discussed this.
No worries. So I define the overall efficiency of the court in different ways. One is, of course, the backlog resolution, like what fraction of all active cases which have been pending in that court for at least a year or over have been resolved. And there are a bunch of other variables that I create, and then I also create an index of court level efficiency. And so basically I use the IV approaches to use these vacancies as an instrument for these court level measures. But these are the only measures that I can calculate at the court level. Other measures of administration, whether management or infrastructure and so on, I don't have that in my data. But if things are fair, I do have the court district fixed effect, so that anything that's sort of time invariant is kind of absorbed in the district fixed effect.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That answers.
thanks to all of you for a really great paper. I'm really glad we managed to put this kind of political economy program together. I'm also very excited about the fact that with this new format where we run a theme per day, we have kind of much better attendance in some of those sessions, hopefully. Also good for kind of spreading information and getting people who might not have been able to, unfortunately, secure visas to come. So we're really excited about this. Have a good, I don't know, day, afternoon, evening, whichever applies. So
Thank you.
thanks everyone, and
Thank you.
see you tomorrow, hopefully.